I've chosen the title Band of Brothers for a couple of reasons. First, because it fits the story that we're going to explore tonight in our stroll down the biblical boulevard of broken people, people that God redeemed and repurposed. Second, because this is Memorial Day weekend, and I want to pause and remember the more than 1.1 million American soldiers who have died on battlefields, foreign and domestic. And I want you to realize that before Israel was a nation, it was a family. And before it was a family, it was a man. And that man had 12 sons. And this is their story. So I'm breaking it into three parts. Part one, I would like to call the family circus. These brothers were born to Jacob. They were spread among four moms. There were two wives who happened also to be sisters, Leah and Rachel. Leah, the Bible tells us, was not much to look at, but she was a sweet gal and a baby-making machine. Rachel, on the other hand, for a long time was unable to have children, and it was a real source of frustration for Rachel and a source of pride for Leah that she could have the kids that Rachel couldn't have, and so that was kind of the favor the Lord played Leah because she was not favored by her husband. And then there were two handmaids that got into the mix, and their names sound like cigarette lighters brands to me, Zilpah and Bilhah. Zilpah was Leah's handmaid, and she gave Jacob two sons, Gad and Asher. I have a nephew named Asher. I don't have any named Gad. I'd like for somebody to do that. Bilhah was Rachel's servant, and she also became Jacob's wife, and she bore Dan and Naphtali. You know, as a parent of adult children now, I've learned that there's so many ways that parents can screw up their kids. And it seems like Jacob and his wives thought of just about all of them. You see why I call it the family circus. It was a real mess. Yeah, I mean, it was, can you even imagine the atmosphere that these children grew up in? So part one is the family circus. Part two, I'm going to call Brothers in Arms. For a long time there, Joseph was the baby in the family. And Jacob being, if nothing else, consistent in his ways as a husband and a father, once again we see Jacob favoring somebody together. And now he has all of these sons, and he favors the baby. He favors Joseph. And this has expected results and unintended consequences. So the brothers are fed up with the favoritism from Pops, and they're annoyed by baby brothers crowing about them someday bowing to him. And that's when things get interesting. We go over to Genesis chapter 37, and we pick up in verse 12. Now Joseph's brothers saw him in the distance, and before he arrived, they plotted to kill him. They said, "Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. We can say that a vicious animal has devoured him. Then we shall see what becomes of his dreams." When Reuben heard this, remember Reuben's the oldest, when Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue Joseph from their hands. "Let's not take his life," he said. "Don't shed his blood. Throw him into this pit in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him. Don't hurt him." Reuben said this so that he could rescue Joseph from their hands and return him to their father. So Reuben had a plan to come back later and help Joseph get back to dad. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the robe of many colors he was wearing, and they took him and they threw him in the pit. Now the pit was empty, no water in it. And as they sat down to eat a meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were carrying spices, balm, and myrrh on their way down to Egypt. So these were traders. Then Judah said to his brothers, "What profit will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay a hand on him, for he's our brother, our own flesh." And they agreed. So that brings me to part three, the most important, the most significant part of this whole thing. And that is a reckoning, a redemption, and a reconciliation. And that famine that we just talked about is what brings this band of brothers back face to face with the betrayed. It's such a big story to tell, and you can read about it in detail in Genesis 42 and 43, two whole chapters. But let me give you the highlights. Jacob Now Israel sends his sons to Egypt to buy grain because of the famine. They get word, as everybody else has, that Egypt has plenty while everybody else is suffering. So he sends his son with silver to buy grain so that they can survive this terrible famine. Benjamin, the baby in the family, the only son that Joseph doesn't know, the one that was born to Rachel after Joseph was gone, did not go with them. He decides to test them to see if they are still the duplicitous, jealous bunch that they had always been. And so he says, look, I'll let you buy grain and I'll do business with you and I'll make sure that you have enough to get through this famine. But I want to meet your younger brother. You go back and bring Benjamin to meet me. And when you do that, then I'll do business with you. But to make sure you come back, I'm going to take this brother over here, Simeon, and put him in prison and hold him until you return. So the brothers do bring Benjamin. And Joseph meets Benjamin for the first time. And Joseph decides to test them again to see if they will sacrifice Benjamin the way they had sacrificed him for their own good. And so sabotages Benjamin by putting his own personal silver cup in Benjamin's bag. He declares it missing. He orders that the bags be searched, and the cup is discovered in Benjamin's bag. And this is what happened in Genesis chapter 44, beginning in verse 18. Then Judah approached Joseph. Now remember, Judah's the one who had the bright idea of profiting off of selling Joseph. Let's don't kill him when we can sell him for a profit, and we won't have his blood on our hands. So you just remember that was Judah who influenced the other brothers to sell Joseph in the first place. Then Judah approached Joseph and said, Sir, please, let your servant speak personally to my Lord. So if the boy is not with us when I return to your servant, and if my father, whose life is wrapped up in the boy's life, sees that the boy's not with us, he'll die. Then your servants will have brought the gray hair of your servant our father down to the grave in sorrow. Indeed, your servant guaranteed the boy's safety to my father, saying, if I do not return him to you, I will bear the guilt before you, my father, all my life. So Judah put his own life on the line and said, Father, I promise you on my life, I will get Benjamin back to you safely. Now, please, let your servant stay here as my Lord's slave in place of the boy. Let him return with his brothers. For how can I go back to my father without the boy? I could not bear to see the misery that would overwhelm him. Judah was the one that started this whole slavery business. He's the one that started the ball rolling. And now Judah is saying, I will be your slave. Whatever you would do to Benjamin, do to me instead. But please don't hold Benjamin accountable for it. He doesn't know whether Benjamin's taken that cup or not. All he knows is that he had given his word to his father. You see the difference there? You see the difference in Judah? Now he's willing to sacrifice life and limb to keep baby brother Benjamin from a terrible fate. So here's what happens in Genesis chapter 45. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before his attendants, and he cried out, Send everyone away from me. So none of them were with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. But he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household soon heard of it. Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? But they were unable to answer him because they were terrified in his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, Please come near me. And they did so. He said, I'm Joseph, your brother, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves that you sold me into this place, because it was to save lives that God sent me before you. For the famine has covered the land these 2 years, and there will be 5 more years without plowing or harvest. God sent me before you to preserve you as a remnant on the earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. Therefore, it was not you who sent me here, but God. Man, can you imagine what that was like to hear that story, to hear Joseph's journey and to realize that this man that the most powerful nation on earth revered so greatly, this man who was responsible single-handedly for saving this great country from the famine, is the brother they betrayed. So they're allowed to go back, and Pharaoh gets involved. And Pharaoh says, I'll tell you what you do. You go get your dad, you get all your stuff, and you move here to the land of Goshen. Goshen is a land where there's plenty of resources. It's very near to the capital, and you'll be under my protection. You'll be under the protection of my people, and we'll treat you with honor and dignity. And so Jacob and the family are able to move to Goshen, and Jacob is reunited with his son, Joseph. And soon after that, Jacob dies, an old man. And Jacob's death is a national event in Egypt. Pharaoh himself sees to it that he's properly lamented and honored and buried where he asked to be buried. But once Jacob's out of the picture, once Jacob is gone, Joseph's brothers, still ridden with guilt and shame, are sure that Joseph will now exact his revenge. They've convinced themselves that the only reason Joseph didn't get revenge before was because of his love for his father. But now Dad's gone, and what will Joseph do? So we go to Genesis chapter 50, verse 15. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, what if Joseph bears a grudge? Then he'll surely repay us for all the evil that we did to him. So they sent word to Joseph saying, before he died, your father commanded, this is what you are to say to Joseph. I beg you, please forgive the transgression and sin of your brothers, for they did you wrong. So now Joseph, please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father. When their message came to him, Joseph wept. His brothers also came to him, bowed down before him, and said, we are your slaves. Joseph replied, do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? As for you, what you intended for evil, God intended for good. In order to accomplish a day like this, to preserve the lives of many people. Therefore, do not be afraid. I will provide for you and your little ones. So Joseph reassured his brothers and spoke kindly to them. These men who had lived an entire life ridden with guilt and regret, this band of brothers with blood on their hands, were at long last rescued, redeemed, and restored. And if you should wonder about the significance of their lives, remember this. Their father Jacob is Israel, a prince with God. These men were literally the children of Israel. And these men would father the 12 tribes of Israel. And their family would become a nation, God's people. What they meant for evil, God meant for good. What they did out of jealousy, God allowed in his providence. Even while they disgraced themselves, God had built into their very actions their own saving grace. And isn't that how God works? Look at Calvary. Wicked men sought to destroy Jesus. With jealous hands they took him. With lying lips they betrayed him. With wicked hearts they cried, crucify him. We will not have him to be Lord over us. Do you hear how they echoed the words of their forefathers concerning Joseph? The original children of Israel hated the dreamer, and their descendants hated the dream. So they crucified Jesus. But what they meant for evil, God meant for good. God meant it for good. Remember that in your brokenness. Remember that in your guilt. Remember that in your shame. There has not been, nor will there ever be, a moment when God is not sovereign, gracious, and good. Only the broken will ever know the power of God in their lives.